Okay, so welcome to our fifth installment of the 2023 Interdisciplinary Speaker Series on the ethics of argumentation. Today we have an especially exciting talk for you. Dr. Malcolm Keating is going to talk. He's an associate professor at Yale News in Singapore, and he works on the Indian Nyāya tradition. And specifically about debate norms, epistemology, and the philosophy of language in that tradition. And today he's going to talk to us about dispassionate debate, early Nyāya philosophy on avoiding cognitive biases. So he's going to tell us things that we all definitely need to know. Take it away, Malcolm. Thank you so much for coming.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It may be a little high expectation setting, but I'll see what I can do. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Just one moment. Okay, I'm hoping that you all can see the screen. Good. Okay. So today I will be speaking to you about early Nyāya philosophy on avoiding cognitive biases. The emphasis will be on the early Nyāya philosophy, and I'm going to do my best to trace out connections to cognitive biases. Those of you in the audience who have expertise there, I'm hoping that you can help me out with this research project. So that's why I'm excited about giving this talk today. So I'm starting with an observation about how Nyāya philosophers talk about good argumentation. They define it partly, at least in terms of the moral psychology of the participants, that is, in being dispassionate. And so this is the starting point. This is an observation that I think is fairly uncontroversial. What I'm curious about is why they do this. And part of the explanation, I think, is because they recognize the impact of emotion on reasoning, perhaps similar to the concept of cognitive and or emotional biases. And my talk today has as its goal to show you what Nyāya philosophers say about being dispassionate and about its connection to argument. And so, like I said, I'm looking forward to hearing from the audience about what connections you might have to your own areas of expertise on this. So my goal today is to introduce Nyāya philosophy to you all. It may not be a term that you all are familiar with, although it's getting more play in philosophy and other areas more broadly. We'll talk a little bit about Nyāya moral psychology. We'll talk about what it is to be a dispassionate debater. We'll talk a little bit about responsibility for error, which I think is important in their account. Turn to attention, emotion, fallacies, and yoga. And then we'll raise a couple of further questions about this account. So to start out, just a very brief introduction to who Nyāya philosophers are. And just in terms of pronunciation, the NY is like a nya sound, essentially. So just sort of the way that I try and help people with it sometimes is if you're old enough to know about the Three Stooges, or you're familiar with American TV in that way, there's a character that would say nyuk nyuk. It's not exactly the same sound, but if you can get that nya at the beginning, it's Nyāya. So that's Nyāya. And Nyāya is a Sanskrit term. It means something like right reasoning or norm or rule. And Nyāya philosophers were concerned with norms of reasoning. And in particular, they were concerned with things like epistemology and debate practices. Now, it's a practice, it's a tradition found in the Indian subcontinent. And it falls within what we would today probably characterize as Hindu, because these are thinkers that take certain texts like the Vedas as their starting point. And so their concern for moral psychology is part of their concern with what today we might call something like religious matters, although the division between religion and philosophy is fairly modern. But their concern extended into other areas like epistemology and debate. They were also concerned with metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and some other topics, but they're really well known for their work on epistemology and debate practices. So in my talk today, I'm going to use the term debate and argumentation basically interchangeably, although I recognize that they're not necessarily the same thing. In the Nyāya context, we're talking about some fairly formal debate styles, although it could also extend to some more sort of student-teacher kinds of contexts, or even informal kinds of practices. So their concern with epistemology and debate led them to reflect on ways of knowing, also called epistemic instruments sometimes, like perception or inference or testimony. And when they're focusing on debate, they're concerned with things like what kinds of debates are there, sort of a typology of debates, how you reason well within a debate, what count as fallacies, how to avoid fallacies, how to recognize them, norms of inference and evidence giving, et cetera, et cetera. So big picture, like other Indian philosophical traditions, many of them, it begins with a sutra text, which is a short statements that were memorized and that then form the basis for oral teaching that were later written down. And this text comes from about the 150 Common Era or so. And then you have philosophical commentators that write on and unpack the ideas in the text, especially in relationship to objections from other philosophical traditions. In particular, Buddhism was as a major opponent of Nyāya philosophy, although they did agree, interestingly, in some areas. We'll set the Buddhists to the side until Q&A if you have questions there. So I'll be talking about some of the philosophical commentators today, basically. So this will be within the period of 450 to 950 Common Era. Okay. That's the intro for those of you who aren't already aware of that material. So let me turn to Nyāya moral psychology. And this is in the context of a larger, like I said, sort of religious soteriological set of concerns. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be bracketing a lot of them. I do that not because I think that's, I do that for the purposes of simplicity. I think it's important to understanding what they're doing to get the big picture. And in my scholarly work, I try and do that. For the purposes of this talk, though, I just want to dive into how they understand human emotions in context of argumentation. So I'm going to teach you 2 to 3 Sanskrit terms for the talk. And I'm doing this because these are terms that characterize sort of emotional sorts of attitudes, experiences, and they don't necessarily map on neatly to a single synonym in English. And so I think it's helpful to kind of get a Sanskrit term here to hang on to. And so these two are found as a pair when Nyāya philosophers talk about emotions. It's raga and dvesha. And raga is something like attachment or intense desire. And I'll say more about both of these in a moment. I've used I think it's called the hugging face emoji to illustrate this. It's sort of like a grasping or desiring. Dvesha is the opposite of this. This is a kind of aversion, revulsion, even a sort of hatred or anger. And so these are sort of 2 opposite poles. And Nyāya philosophers think of these as the sort of central moral flaws that human beings have in terms of our emotional, psychological life. So here's one of the philosophical commentators that I was indicating would write on the Nyāya Sutra. This is Vachaspati Mishra. He's writing somewhere in the 9th, 10th century. And he says that aversion, anger, and rage are all synonyms. So this term dvesha can also be understood as anger or rage. He says it's the self being inflamed. In contrast, dispassion, he says, is not like this. For dispassion is the thought, enough. And this is not in opposition to removing suffering. Well, okay, what does this mean? We'll talk about dispassion in a minute, but the idea here is that aversion or dvesha is a kind of intense inflammation, sort of fiery dislike of something, aversion of something. And we might also think oppositely to that. Attachment also has this phenomenological kind of intensity. Dispassion lacks this kind of intensity. But that doesn't mean that a dispassionate person doesn't do things like act to remove suffering. because of the sort of the big picture here for a lot of these Indian traditions, Buddhism and Nyaya philosophy, is that one of the major goals of human ethical existence is to remove suffering. And that's in common to Buddhists and Nyaya philosophers, although they think there are different ways to do this. And so you might think, well, the reason that we want to remove suffering is because suffering is unpleasant, and we have to have this sort of aversion to suffering in order to remove it. But what Vachaspati Mishra and other Nyaya philosophers say is, no, that's not the case. You can desire to avoid suffering, but to do so in a dispassionate way, in a way that isn't you being inflamed and sort of pushing something away and saying, oh, that's horrible, it's awful, and having this sort of intense phenomenology. So being a dispassionate person is the goal for Nyaya philosophers, and indeed many other kinds of Indian traditions. And so, in other words, a dispassionate person can say enough to something like suffering or injustice or so on without being sort of inflamed. Okay, so raga and dvesha, then, this sort of pair, they're opposites. They are characterized by an intense attachment and aversion to objects. They are also the motivating force for our activity. It is because of raga and dvesha that human beings, most human beings, tend to act. So the dispassionate person, though, is going to act out of a different motivation, not because of aversion or attachment. And the reason that they motivate us to act is because we, as human beings who are captured by raga and dvesha, we want to experience pleasure and we want to avoid pain. And so when we have these sort of experiences of pleasure, we are attached to it, we want more. When we have these experiences of pain, we're averse to it, we want to reduce it. And that is what drives our activity. But for Nyaya philosophers, this kind of intense attachment and aversion that motivates our activity originates in ignorance. So if we really understand what we are like as human beings, as conscious beings, they're substance dualists, essentially. We are ensouled kind of beings. We have a self or an Atman, which is eternal and is separate from the bodily self. Once you understand the sort of metaphysics of how the world is, you are not going to be intensely attached to things which you think cause you pleasure, but in fact are not good for you, right? And this is, I think, in some ways a very ordinary insight that, there's a lot of things that we may become attached to which aren't good for us. And once we come to understand what those things really are, we may not be attached to them, right? So if you are attached to chocolate cake or something, and you because you experience pleasure from eating chocolate cake, but once you start to kind of recognize what actually eating all of the chocolate cake does to you, you might turn out to sort of moderate that, right? But of course, here for Nyaya philosophers, this is a sort of a broader and deeper sense of ignorance. This is a deeper ignorance about the way that the world is, not about sort of our caloric intake. And in fact, one of the things that sort of on the food metaphors, one of the things that an early commentator of the Nyaya Sutra says is, you wouldn't eat a dessert that, the baker said, look, I put some poison in there, but there's just a little bit of poison in it. You wouldn't go ahead and just like say, well, I'll just try and pick apart the parts that aren't poison and the parts that are poison. You wouldn't want the dessert at all, no matter how sort of pleasant and tasty it was. And this is the way that they think about the objects of ordinary human desire, is that there's a sense in which the things that we tend to desire, really, they cause us pain in a number of ways, not just sort of physical pain, but even sort of deep existential pain when things end and we're attached to them and so on. And so it's this kind of deep ignorance about the world that they're trying to address. And that is what their focus on epistemology is about, because we can remove our ignorance by knowledge. And that then is part of breaking this chain that leads us to act in these ways, because of our intense attachment. A note, though, the kind of knowledge that we need to have is not just a sort of a mere thought, sort of, a list of facts, but we have to have a sort of a maturing, a ripening of our understanding. So this will connect to the yogic practices that I'll talk about a little bit later. It has to be a sort of intense attention on these ideas and an intense sort of internalizing of these ideas, such as the existence of the self and so on. And like I said here, there's this phenomenological element to the attachment and aversion, which also will be removed by our knowledge. Okay, I think I've made it pretty clear, but let me give you just a quick example of what raga is, and you can sort of invert this for dvesha as they're sort of polar opposites. So if you have a false belief, I am my body, right? This is a paradigmatic false belief for Nyāya philosophers. From this false belief, you might then, through identification with your body, be really attached to bodily pleasures. For instance, you might like the bodily pleasure of going really fast. Trying to think of an updated example here. And so one thing that might happen from this is that you might say, well, that person has a really fast car. I don't. I really desire that person's fast car. And under the right circumstances, you might then decide that you're going to go out and steal that person's fast car and do something immoral. Okay, now not everybody, of course, goes out and steals cars just because of their attachment to their body. Nyāya philosophers don't think that. But part of the explanation for our activities of our sort of immoral activities is because of having these false beliefs which motivate us. Which are the basis of our having these sorts of attachments and aversions, and that is motivating us to act in these different ways. And big cosmological picture here, the goal is to stop this kind of activity. And this is beyond the scope of what's relevant here for our talk, but I can talk about that in Q&A if you want. Okay. So this is a snapshot of what's going on with raga. Just to underscore things, Vatsyayana, an early commentator in the 4th, 5th century, says, motivated by the flaws, so these are aversion and attachments, a person engaging in action performs injury, theft, and forbidden sex. With their speech performs false, harsh, slanderous, and incoherent speech. With their mind performs malice towards others. Craving for others' possessions, and nihilism. This is sort of nihilism is like the denial of these sorts of Vedic beliefs, like the belief in the Vedic text or the belief in God or gods. These very vicious practical undertakings give rise to demerit. So basically, attachment and aversion leads to these negative actions. And these negative actions have consequences throughout our lives. They give rise to further negative activity and so on. Okay, what we want for Nyāya philosophers is to be a vita raga, a person who lacks attachment or aversion. They lack revulsion or desire. They are a dispassionate person. You might say something like detached, although that might give a little bit of the wrong connotation here. So the key is for all human beings, being dispassionate is a moral goal. It's a moral goal that everyone should strive towards. Now I'm just going to anticipate here real quickly. This is not, I think, a very popular view contemporarily, and I think there's pushback against this kind of idea in a lot of work that's being done. And I think one thing that to keep in mind here is that the folks that are writing these texts are sort of Brahminical philosophers in the Indian subcontinent. They were typically sort of at the sort of educational top and the sort of social top of things. So I think that might be potentially relevant to some criticisms of their views here. So I'll just note that now. But still, there's a long tradition of this idea, right, that human beings should strive to be, at least in some ways, detached or not moved by their external circumstances. So, okay, how does this go back to argumentation? Well, we're going to see that two Nyāya philosophers, Vachaspati Mishra and Jayanta Bhatta, in about the 9th, 10th century, define argumentation or debate in terms of being for a vita raga, for a person who is like this, being dispassionate. And one of them even talks about being dispassionate as a kind of prerequisite or an eligibility for participation in this kind of debate. And so I'm interested in why, what the connection is. So last thing just to underscore here, which I think I've probably already done, but this is a nice description by Arindam Chakrabarti about Vachaspati's passage that we saw a little bit ago about how suffering can still be removed by someone who's dispassionate. So he says that true, a piece of anger, spitefulness, or aversion is an element of bondage. The idea here is this is karmic bondage. This is going to keep you not only it's not only kind of existentially a bad thing for you in this life, but it's going to result in you being reborn and reborn again and again and again in this cosmological system. But even if we sort of chop it off into one life, it's a bad thing for you, right? But that is the aversion, which is the type of a blazing fire. And this is not how the seeker, the sort of person aiming towards the good life, should feel towards worldly sufferings. His characteristic mood is that of a non-attached person for whom the earthly life is of no taste whatsoever. We can have a sense of not wanting something, thinking something is like enough, we don't want more of that, without feeling aggressively scornful about it. This quiet cognition of dispensability is what we think the seeker ought to feel towards the plights of human bondage. So this is a sort of sense of Nyāya philosophy. Okay, so how does this fit in with debate? So in Nyāya philosophy, they distinguish between three kinds of debate. And public debates were a major part of pre-modern Indian culture. In courts as entertainment for the rich and powerful. Medical doctors used debates to address controversies. Religious topics, law, all kinds of things were addressed by public debate. And so there are three kinds of debates for Nyāya philosophers. The sort of paradigmatic truth-seeking debate they call discussion. The other two kinds of debate they recognize, and they tend to talk about them as derivative of and degenerate in terms of discussion. So we have disputation and we have wrangling. So discussion is the kind of debate that Nyāya philosophers think is really the kind that is conducive to knowing, to coming to know things about the world. And it is the kind of things that in Arindam Chakrabarti's words, seekers should engage in. If you want to remove your ignorance, you should engage in discussion. And so discussion, in the words of the Nyāya Sutra, is taking up a standpoint and a contrary standpoint. And this taking up is supported and criticized by ways of knowing, like inference, and suppositional reasoning. This is considering the outcome of a hypothetical scenario. Which does not contradict settled claims, you have to be consistent, and which is obtained by the five components of inference. We're not going to get into this right now, but inference had a particular form in Nyāya philosophy that had five member statements, five components, and that was the structure that was required. So basically, you need to use genuine reasoning that's consistent with what's already been established as true, with what you accept. You have to employ a particular kind of inference. And this is discussion. This is what people should aim at. But in contrast, disputation is support and criticism by way of equivocations, faulty or sometimes misleading rejoinders, and points of defeat. We'll talk about the points of defeat, especially in what comes next. But basically, this kind of argumentation, this kind of debate involves the intentional use of equivocations as well as other flaws, misleading rejoinders where you're trying to pass off a criticism which doesn't actually target the opponent. And then points of defeat, which include things like performative flaws as well as fallacious reasoning. We'll look at those in a few moments. So disputation basically involves someone trying to get away with tricks. That's the difference between disputation and discussion. Even though inference may be involved, in disputation, somebody's aiming at victory. And they want to get victory regardless of what method they can use. If they can pass off a fallacy, if they can pass off an equivocation as good reasoning, they'll do it. Okay, wrangling is really comes in for criticism from Nyāya philosophers. He says, disputation becomes wrangling when there is no setting forward an opposing position. Most, save for maybe one, I think early Nyāya philosophers accept this, that you need to have a position and a counterposition. that someone who only criticizes an opponent's view is doing something, I think they would say even morally wrong. You're hiding your genuine position. You're in a sense being deceitful. So simply criticizing is a degenerate form of argumentation. You should come in with a position and put your cards on the table, metaphorically speaking. So what we have is when you have wrangling, which involves equivocations and trying to win, and you have someone who refuses to put forward their own position, then you have wrangling. So disputation becomes wrangling when there's no setting forward an opposing position. Okay, so these are the three types of debate that Nyāya philosophers distinguish. Now, Vachaspati Mishra and Jayanta Bhatta, I said two philosophers writing in the 9th, 10th centuries, they begin to involve this idea of vita raga in their definition of discussion. So Vachaspati Mishra says, by doing just this much, that is, he's talking about using inference and good ways of reasoning. By doing just this much, discussion's nature is supporting and disapproving by ways of knowing, that's inference, and hypothetical reasoning, since its intended aim is determining the truth, as it is discourse for the dispassionate person. So the idea here is that the dispassionate person engages in this kind of discourse, because they want to know the truth. But in contrast, disputation and wrangling have their basis in things which are not ways of knowing. So it's now part of the definition that discussion is discourse for the dispassionate person. This wasn't in previous layers of the commentary. Jayanta Bhatta around the same time says the same thing. Now, Jayanta Bhatta and Vachaspati Mishra overlap in time. Who comes first, whether they knew each other or not, is a matter of scholarly debate. There's a lot of overlap in what they're saying. Maybe there was somebody else out there that they're both drawing on. Hard to say. I'm going to set all that kind of stuff aside. But what we see is another philosopher at the same time starts emphasizing that that discussion is discourse for the dispassionate person. And he says it's discussion that results in certainty about a matter. The goal here is not just interpersonal agreement, but actually coming to have certainty about the truth of a matter. And then in contrast, disputation is contentious discourse that results in a test of the participants' abilities. By that, he just means that the goal in disputation is just to see who's a better arguer, in the sense of being able to kind of get away with tricky reasoning. You can win in disputation whether you have settled the matter on the merits or not. You can win simply by managing to persuade someone, even if there has been no certainty about a matter, or you can win by seeming to tear down your opponent, showing, giving doubt to their point of view, again, whether or not you have genuinely done so. So that's the disputation here. Okay, so if we think about who it is that engages in these kinds of argumentation, this kind of debate, so the discussant versus the disputer and the wrangler, we look back, not just Vachaspati Mishra and Jayanta Bhatta, but earlier thinkers. How can we characterize the kinds of people that are engaged in these practices? How do they talk about them? Well, we see that Vachaspati Mishra has said that the discussant desires only the truth. So the thing that they are aiming for in a debate is only the truth. Well, to think a little bit about the kind of desire here in light of this idea of aversion and attachment. But he does say what they want is not winning. They don't want monetary gain, which sometimes come along with these debates. They just want the truth. Okay. And that is also what motivates them, right? It could be that they desire that, but they're motivated by something else. But no, the thing that they desire and are motivated by is the truth, is seeking out the truth. Udyotakara says that these are people who are willing to learn. In particular, discussion is kind of paradigmatically for almost like the classroom. Students and teachers engage in this kind of debate. And even when they are engaging in sort of taking a contrary position, Vachaspati says they're not proud. So they're basically disposed to be able to be corrected. They're not overly attached to their own viewpoints. In contrast, the disputer or the wrangler here, they are characterized as desiring material gain, praise, and fame. In the Indian context in this time, if you were to dispute with somebody in a public debate setting, you might get material gain from the ruler who decides to sort of fund your religious group. You certainly might win acclaim, you might win fame, you might win students who then are going to come and give you gifts and essentially pay for you to teach them. So there were things at stake in these debates. And a disputer or a wrangler is characterized as someone who is aiming for those things. That's what they want when they're engaging in disputation or wrangling. And interestingly, wranglers are characterized by Vachaspati Mishra as being motivated by the pleasure they gain from criticism. I think I've said this either on Twitter or a podcast somewhere. Somebody else raised this as a suggestion to me as well, that trolling, modern day trolling seems very similar to this, right? There's a kind of pleasure people gain from poking at others, from criticizing them without taking up a position of their own. And so Vachaspati here is identifying that, well, what is the motive for doing this? If they don't have their own position, why would they engage in this? He says it's because they gain pleasure from this kind of criticism. And then finally, in terms of the kinds of people, in contrast to the learners, Vachaspati says that these people who engage in disputation and wrangling, are excessively contrary. So they take up a contrary position, and that's fine, but they're excessively contrary. So there's something like they seem to maybe, again, enjoy taking up an opposing position. And he also says that they have a pride in their poor ideas, which I take it leads to poor reasoning. So again, pride comes in here. These are people who are characterized as having bad ideas or bad critical reasoning skills or something, and yet they have pride in it. And that because of that attachment to their bad ideas, their bad reasoning, that leads them to also reason poorly in the context of these debates. And so they engage in equivocations, sometimes intentionally, perhaps unintentionally, because they just have no idea that they're making a mistake. Okay, so we have these two different kinds of people that are characterized as engaging in debate, but now everybody makes mistakes when they argue. Everybody can accidentally engage in equivocation, accidentally target the wrong premise, make mistakes, right? So how do Nyāya philosophers think about errors and our responsibilities for them? How does that fit into the picture here? Well, Nyāya philosophers have this category that they call points of defeat. Points of defeat are ways to lose in a competitive debate. And they characterize them starting with a Jyotikara, a little bit in Vatsyayana, but especially in a Jyotikara, as ways of misunderstanding or as a failure to understand entirely. Now, this category of points of defeat, it doesn't really apply in discussion, except for a couple of them, which we don't need to get into, because there's no losing. In discussion, if someone makes a mistake, the idea is that they're disposed to be corrected and talk it out, and the debate would continue, the discussion would continue. But in a competitive debate where there is a winner or a loser, there's typically a judge who will say, aha, you have equivocated there, or aha, you have committed a fallacy of ad hominem, right? These are ways that someone loses a debate. And Jyotikara talks extensively about how the different points of defeat, which many of them map onto fallacies we're familiar with today, are ways of misunderstanding or just failing to understand completely, missing it entirely. And what's interesting is that Vatsyayana says that misunderstanding is either simply wrong understanding or it's contemptible understanding. So there's a sort of moral dimension here. And then he says not understanding is when somebody doesn't undertake a topic already undertaken, or they don't try and refute a position or answer a refutation. So we have kind of misunderstanding, right? Not quite getting it. And then we have totally missing the point, misunderstanding and not understanding. But misunderstanding, he says, sometimes it can be contemptible. what does that mean? Well, Vachaspati Mishra gives an explanation, and he says that contemptible misunderstanding is when one misunderstands ordinary material things, or you might say even perceptible things. And he says morally neutral misunderstanding, or non-contemptible, is when you misunderstand subtle subjects. And he gives examples of things like imperceptible entities. So we might extrapolate from that we have, as reasoners, moral responsibility for getting certain things right, which are within the scope of our perceptual and maybe even inferential abilities. If we get those things wrong, there's something that has gone wrong beyond merely making a mistake. So you might think people who are, and I don't want to get too deep into sort of speculating here, but you might think someone who sort of misunderstands the the roundness of the world, given the roundness of the globe, given testimony and sort of deliverances of science when confronted with all of these facts. You might say, well, there's something that's gone wrong there that they are morally on the hook for. And in the Nyāya context, I think it would be something like they might diagnose it as they're attached to something that is motivating them to attend to certain things and not attend to other things. And that'll become a little bit clearer in a moment. Regardless of the particular examples, and unfortunately, Vachaspati Mishra didn't give me any examples to give to you today. He doesn't explain. It seems like there might be cases of misunderstanding where people are morally on the hook for it. Nyāya philosophers do want to at least say there are some errors that are ones we're morally culpable for. So when they're putting all these pieces together in terms of thinking about debate, it's not merely that we are responsible for reasoning well in terms of being sort of good at logic or good at inference, but it is that we are also responsible for our, I think, attachments and aversions and our emotional states, which may influence our reasoning. I think these things are going to come together for Nyāya philosophy, and I'll make that point in the next couple of slides, and then we'll be done for questions. So the points of defeat, some of which are misunderstandings, some of which are failures to understand, some of which may be contemptible, some of which may be morally neutral. There are 22 of them that they identify. And I'm just going to give you a few examples here that I think might illustrate what's going on. So when we're engaged in disputation or sort of competitive defeat of this kind, shifting to a different topic would be an example of a point of defeat. If your opponent puts forward one claim and you start to talk about another claim without responding to the claim your opponent has put forward, that is, and sort of you're subtly shifting the focus of the argumentation, that is a point of defeat. You're caught out on that, you lose. Meaningless repetition. This is an interesting one. Repetition has to be meaningful. Simply restating something again and again would count as a point of defeat. An inability to re-articulate your opponent's point, especially when that's a point that the audience understands, the judge understands, everybody else understands that if you can't re-articulate that point, you show misunderstanding here or failure to understand, and that's a point of defeat. Overlooking an objectionable claim. If somebody puts forward a claim that is in some way defective, right? Somebody argues maybe using a fallacy. If you overlook that and you get caught, that's a point of defeat. If you present a claim that's inconsistent with your own views and you don't catch it, that's a point of defeat. If you use a faulty reason, it would be a pseudo reason in Nyāya terminology, one that doesn't actually support the thesis, that's a point of defeat. Now, again, importantly in disputation, this is the sort of thing where if you do these sorts of things intentionally or accidentally and you're not caught on it, you can still win a debate, right? But if you're caught on it, your opponent catches you or a judge catches you, you would lose the debate. in discussion, if you shift to a different topic, someone's going to say something, right? And then you don't lose. You say, oh, okay, thank you, right? I didn't mean to shift to a different topic, or, oh, I thought this was relevant in this way, right? Because your goal is different. Your goal is not simply winning. Okay, how does this all connect to attention, emotion, fallacies, I promised, cognitive biases, and yoga? Well, as you can see from the text and from what's going on here, there's a lot of moving parts, and this is the start of a larger research project that I've been involved in, different bits and pieces for a while. But Nyāya philosophers are, as I said, part of this broader sort of soteriological religious tradition. They are also interested in yoga, not the kind of postural yoga that we're familiar with today, although postures were important. But they're thinking about yoga in this sense. And so this is Stephen Phillips' translation of the Nyāya Sutra here. For the purpose of attaining the supreme felicity of life, there should be self-purification by yogic disciplines. And here they mean things like moral principles like non-injury, truth-telling, not stealing, sexual restraint, non-possessiveness, right, not stealing, and observances, and by psychological instructions and methods taught in yoga. This involves things like meditation, focusing on what they take to be the deep self that exists, focusing your practices of attention, being able to regulate your breathing, being able to regulate your emotions. All of these sorts of things are packed in here to yogic disciplines. But importantly, there's a very strong moral thread throughout all this. This is not merely to sort of like, I don't know, strengthen your quads or something like that. This is a larger sort of set of practices. So Nyāya philosophers have said, as we've seen, that knowledge of reality is necessary for the removal of moral flaws. And knowledge involves these proper ways of using the ways of reasoning, like inference. They also focus on the attention that's involved in knowledge. We have to attend to the proper objects. This is definitely the case for perception, but also for inference, being able to identify what counts as evidence, being able to attend to the parts of your opponent's argument which are relevant for you to object to. So attention is a theme that comes up through the Nyāya Sutras, and I don't have time to get into the text, but it's there. And the fallacies are failures of understanding, and also, I think, of failure to attend. There are a lot of fallacies which are failures of relevance, failures to attend to what is relevant as an objection, relevant as a conversational contribution, things like that. So the thread that connects this here to the ethical aspect is the yogic practices. So yogic practices for Nyāya philosophers, which includes meditation and postural practices, train skills in attention and in emotional regulation. I think it's a very important part of removing our attachment and our aversion and attaining this state of being properly dispassionate. Now, Stephen Phillips has already noted this, and I think he's right, that in the Nyāya Sutra, which is 5 chapters, there's at the end of chapter 4, there's a discussion of yogic practice, which is fairly brief, but then it shifts from discussing yogic practice to discussing learning shastras or disciplines of reasoning, excuse me. And you have this emphasis on going up into the mountains and meditating, and also coming down and engaging in discussion in the community. And then chapter 5 plunks in this chapter about fallacies. And people have wondered, why is it arranged in this way? And Stephen Phillips has argued, and I think he's right, that there's a connection here, that the Nyāya philosophers were seeing that these yogic practices and meditation may be relevant for training people to recognize and avoid these fallacies. Because the goal here is to be a dispassionate debater who does not engage in these fallacies themselves, and who can identify them in an opponent who maybe is trying to take discussion into a disputational direction, right? Mm-hmm. So here's one example. Here's where I think this might come together, and then I'm curious about your thoughts. So my side bias is a kind of bias where people seek out evidence that corroborates their existing beliefs. And so thinking about how this might connect to Nyāya philosophy, what are some points of defeat that might be relevant for my side bias and might connect up to these ideas of attachment and aversion and being dispassionate? Well, one point of defeat that I didn't mention is evasion. If you just say, oh, I left the stove on, and you leave the debate faced with an objection, then you've lost. Okay. Likewise, objecting to the unobjectionable. If somebody puts forward a legitimate inference and you criticize it, that is a point of defeat. You've done something wrong. Now, here's a hypothesis. A passionate debater's attachment to their existing beliefs might lead them to commit these faults. They might be so looking for evidence that corroborates their existing beliefs that when they are faced with evidence that seems to challenge their beliefs, they just want to leave. A passionate debater who is attached to their existing beliefs might fail to be able to recognize a good inference when it's staring them right in the face. And they might present an irrelevant objection because of that attachment. These are some hypotheses. One of the things I'm wanting to do is to look more closely at these cognitive and emotional biases and connect them up to these points of debate and think about some of the contemporary literature on how emotional regulation is fitting in here. Now, a dispassionate debater, in this lifetime, we're going to be imperfectly dispassionate. They might still commit these faults, but arguably they would be disposed to receive correction. That is the thrust of Nyāya training and focus on internalizing argumentative rules and these sorts of yogic practices. That even if one were to say, oh, I really want to leave, I'm uncomfortable, they might be disposed to receive correction, and they might have the kind of training to recognize and regulate the emotions that they're having in a debate context. When they are objecting to something and someone says, no, look, this is actually a good inference, see here, they might be disposed to receive that kind of correction. Okay, so that's the sort of big picture of how I'm thinking about Nyāya philosophy and cognitive biases. Two further questions, one which may be raising up to you who are familiar with some of this literature. So Maisha Cherry has written on the idea of moral anger, and she's written about Lordian rage, which I think is maybe consistent with Nyāya dispassion. I'm not sure yet. I haven't thought about it hard enough. But one question we might have is whether Nyāya moral psychology can account for a dispassionate kind of moral anger. I mean, you might think, wait a second, seeing the injustices and the sufferings in the world, is being dispassionate really the right kind of response? This sort of distaste for things of the world? Well, perhaps this is bound up in Nyāya metaphysics, and it's just simply inconsistent with sort of modern political notions of moral anger. But one interesting thing here in Maisha Cherry's book is, she says a person with Lordian rage is empowered by the motivation it provides to not retreat, but to go forward to transform the situation. She distinguishes it between other kinds of anger. I'm not sure. It seems like for Nyāya philosophers, anger shouldn't be the thing that motivates us. Instead, it should be something like a dispassionate knowledge about the way that the world is. I'm not quite certain that those are going to fit together, but I think that's an interesting challenge. Further question is really whether we can fruitfully understand these fallacies in terms of cognitive and emotional biases. There is an existing analysis on the points of defeat on sort of Gricean terms, that there's a lot of ways that these fit in to the sort of Gricean maxims. So Todeschini 2010 for those who are interested in it. And then also the question of the rhetoric dialectic distinction, right? This is typically, talked about in Western context back from ancient Greek philosophy. Is there this distinction here? How do we understand persuasion and detachment? It seems like the Nyāya philosophers are also wanting to persuade people of the truth. Is that in tension with their aims of being a detached debater? So I think these are some further questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. I've gone over the time that I set for myself, but I hope it was interesting to you all. Here's a list of citations, and I'd be happy to send those out to you after the talk as well. Thanks.